All right, welcome to part two, everyone. This part will be fairly short, but I couldn't fit everything into the first 15-minute video. So, Genesis, I just kind of said, see what you see, challenge Merchant a bit, or push your ideas a little bit farther. I don't know that I have a lot more to say there. I just appreciate that you read it and looked for some new insights of your own, right? Some new applications of the ideas or challenges to the ideas, whatever they may be. And that is great. That's how you want to read, right? Is to challenge ideas as much as use them and apply them. So let's take a look at him to Aphrodite. It's interesting. It's written about the same time as we think the Old Testament was written. So these are more or less coeval. They're written at the same time, right? If we look at the opening lines of him to Aphrodite, remember, Aphrodite is the goddess of, usually we say love, and she can be marriage, which can be positive, but also pleasure. And so she is sort of, there's a connotation of sort of sensuality that goes with Aphrodite. So that she's pleasure as much as, or maybe perhaps more so than a sturdy marriage. We can probably make that insight because Aphrodite, remember, is rejected by three people in the opening lines. That's what's going on. And the last one of them is Hestia, who is the goddess of the domestic, of the family. In modern times, we might say of the family unit, or something like that. So we can see that sort of pleasure and sensuality is opposed a little bit to the goddess of the domestic. Hestia does not listen to Aphrodite. They do not join forces. So it's saying to some extent there's a difference between, the high-end pleasures of sensuality and the everyday work of being in a family and being a strong, tight family unit is how we might think of this in the modern day. Two other people that are associated with nature reject Aphrodite as well in the opening lines. And so one thing we can see developing in these rejections is a theme that Aphrodite has something that isn't completely natural, although we do see her associated with nature later. And so one of the important things to take away that I haven't jotted down here, but jot down at the end of the notes, is that the Greeks have a different view of nature, and we can read their environmental views differently by looking at their gods and goddesses and humans and their relationships. In Genesis, in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, it's always kind of top down. God is in charge and tells people what to do. But as you probably know, in Greek myth, there's a mixing of humans and gods. They have children together, and there are sort of half gods, demigods, right, and all this type of thing. You don't see that in Christianity, of course. And what that allows us to do is attach each of these gods or demigods or even people sometimes to different aspects of nature. So Eve represented all of nature, and then maybe Adam doesn't. He's the power over nature, and then there's God that's the power over human beings, right? You don't see that type of really tight, easy symbolism of Eve being all of nature and Adam and God being kind of none of it in some ways, right? Instead, what you get in a Greek environmental reading is that each god or goddess, or maybe even human, represents sort of a different area of nature. So there's not as big of a division of, nature versus humans, or nature versus people, or nature versus the civilized or civilization. You just don't see that quite as much. That would be one way to read him to Aphrodite. And where does that reading come from? Really from the opening right away, because you have Athena. She's the goddess of many things. Justice, law, wisdom, and art. And she doesn't totally give herself over to Aphrodite, who's all pleasure-based. If we want to, say that pleasure is kind of like conquest or domination or something like that, we can see Aphrodite maybe having a bit of Adam's qualities of power, right? But that, Aphrodite and her powers and what she represents are rejected by Athena. More so, we can see Artemis is the goddess of hunting, right? Not warfare, though, not war, not people doing awful, immoral things to each other necessarily, but just of hunting, which is a very ecological thing to do, right? And so Aphrodite is rejected by her as well. So we can see that Aphrodite in the beginning seems to be equated with something that isn't quite based in nature or the balance of nature or the balance of humans in the environment and what is best for that relationship between humans and environment. So that Aphrodite is rejected and doesn't seem to represent completely the natural. That already makes her unlike Eve. So that's one major difference between the two if we give an environmental reading of these two different texts, Genesis and him to Aphrodite. So we see a very, very different type of feminine figure in how it represents nature. how it symbolizes nature. Another thing that comes up inside of here is that Aphrodite keeps trying to persuade them. So this is not top-down power, as we saw in Genesis. People don't get to name the environment, and gods aren't totally in charge of human beings, but rather even gods have to persuade others, have to change their mind and entertain them in some ways to change their mind. And that's very, very different than we saw in the last text. And that's what I'm jotting here. Less hierarchy. It's persuasion, not power, that's at the center of the myth, etc., etc. So you're allowed to challenge power in hymn to Aphrodite and maybe challenge ideas of human-nature relationships. And you're not allowed to do that in Genesis. God says, don't eat from the tree. They do, and they are banished forever, right? So much more top-down rather than bottom-up understanding of the relationship between people and nature in Genesis versus Aphrodite. Let's take a look at some more lines here. To have some interpretive fun with this, we might look at lines 35 through 39, right around in here. Zeus gets, he's always throwing thunderbolts, if you're familiar with Greek mythology at all. So we can attribute something of nature to him. He has some control of the weather, symbolizes the weather a little bit, and other things too, of course. But that's what we get in here. And this is where environmental readings come from. He's connected with the weather to some degree, but also with power through the throwing of the thunderbolts. But here's the interesting thing that makes this, again, different than Genesis. She's undone Zeus, it says. She has seduced, right? And right here we see that. So this is much, much different, makes her different than Eve, and this is a different type of environmental reading than we got from Genesis. What's our big takeaway here so far in these lines? We're beginning to see less hierarchy between the sexes, but also between their role and connection in nature. They each have a different, smaller connection. You have a goddess just for hunting, right? You have a god that seems to be representing weather to some degree and thunderbolts, and that's where power comes from, but that power is challenged. So each god has a small area of the environment, so to speak, that they represent. Also, the distance between nature and humans is not so great. And let's take a look at some examples of that. And I think the better examples are page 34, paragraph 2, when we're down in here. So Anchises, I believe it's pronounced, is a farmer, basically, right? And he's a very noble guy. He's not looked down upon or be seen as uncivilized for being a farmer. In fact, it even says he was pasturing cows and he was like immortals to see. So that means he looks like an immortal, even though he's a farmer. He's pasturing cows. Even when he's farming, he looks powerful. He looks like an immortal, not like a human being, right? And so that's really interesting for us in terms of environmental reading and an environmental interpretation, because we have agriculture being seen as something very, very important. Remember in Genesis, it was a fall into labor, right? It was a fall into taking care of the earth and having to raise food, and that was a big loss. Here we see that rather agriculture is seen in a very positive light, and you can actually be like a god through your labor in agriculture. So very, very different interpretation of agriculture than we get from Genesis and the merchant readings, right? So that's what I just said. No horrible fall into labor here. It's an easy way to remember it, I suppose. What else is going on in here? Lines 70 to 80, we're kind of down at the bottom of the page and up at the top here. Squeeze in as much of the text as I could here, but Aphrodite, we're right up here, has gray wolves and bright-eyed lions and bears and leopards that are insatiable of deer. So she is connected with nature and the beasts here. And so she wasn't earlier, but now she is. And again, she seems to be in charge of the beasts. But what aspect of the beasts? As we find out very quickly, their animal nature, their desire, we could maybe say passion, the same type of thing that is sort of might be in human terms our animal lust, right? The part that we've got to overcome in Genesis, perhaps. That's part of our original sin or our flawed humanity. Here she's actually in charge of it, and that is a very natural thing to have. Sometimes we should fear it, and it's sent away by Hestia, the goddess of the hearth, the goddess of the family. So it is something to be feared, but it's also revered and celebrated at the same time in Aphrodite. And we didn't see that as much in Genesis. It was just something to be, afraid of and is seen as a reason for the fall into being an imperfect human being. So we see the connection from Aphrodite to certain aspects of nature and that they aren't bad like they were in Genesis, right? So that's what I'm saying here, I suppose. Here's the desire she represents. So we might just say there's less contempt of animality and animal nature in human beings. more accepting of human behaviors, all human behaviors, right? Even if they can be problematic. And we know that through Hestia, there is some condemnation of some of these behaviors of passion and desire too. Line 80-ish, seeing them, she rejoiced in her heart and cast in their breast desire, and so they all 2 by 2 took mate. She's talking about the animals here, of course. 2 by 2 reminded me, of course, of Noah's Ark, but there's a difference that also highlights the difference in these texts. 2 by 2, in Noah we had the flood, and so they all got on the boat, right? You all know the story. But Noah's flood was to do what? To wash away sin and start the world over, because the world had become an awful place. This is another example of the fall and the need for recovery. Just wipe everything out and start over, right? But when they're 2 by 2 in Hymn to Aphrodite, what we see is Aphrodite is a symbol of procreation as well. You can get some of that out of Noah, of course, but you don't have an Aphrodite or a Hymn to Aphrodite, a fall in a necessary recovery, right? Rather, it's just about the unity of animals, procreation, and about desire and passion being a bit more natural, accepting that animal part of ourselves a bit more. Right, and seeing a different relationship then with between humans and nature as well. We're not in charge of the animals, rather we share something with them in Hymn to Aphrodite, our animal nature, right? So no condemnation, but rather sharing of that animal nature and a celebration of it through Aphrodite as well. So summing up Aphrodite, I'll just leave these notes up on the screen. I'll talk to them real quick. Remember, you do have these notes if you want to go back and revisit them. They'll be in submodule 1-2 alongside this video. But how is Aphrodite different? Well, she's clearly empowered, not ruled over by an external god. The gods and the humans mix. They can procreate. There's a celebration of desire and our animal passions, right, that you don't see in Genesis. All the gods and humans in Him have some connection to a certain aspect of nature. They don't have a binary separation from it. You could say they're all uncivilized in some ways. That's how we might read it from Genesis. They're uncivilized. But they don't appear to be uncivilized inside of the hymn itself, right? So we've got Zeus and his thunderbolts. We've got Aphrodite and her animals. We've got Anchises, who is like an immortal, yet a farmer. So we've got some pretty positive representations of nature in here. I point these three out because this is a good environmental reading. When we're looking at, well, I've got poetry about trees and water or fishing or something. Clearly nature poetry, environmental stuff. But what else do we look for when a text doesn't seem to be about trees and nature and the easy things that we would call the environment? We look for stuff like this, right? The animals, the agriculture, the weather. All of those type of things become very, very important. Anything from the natural world and the way that humans, or in this case gods, but humans, interact with it. Right, and that's what we're looking for. And then we can give an environmental reading of anything, right, including literature of the city, right, or anything like this. So how are the two origin myths different? Nature is not a binary or an opposite. In Aphrodite, the multiple gods, as I've said many times in this video, represent different elements of the human. Harder to see binaries in Hymn to Aphrodite. We got pretty easy binaries set up in Genesis. And nature is maybe not meant to be conquered in Hymn to Aphrodite. Nature is not a symbol for suffering, and there's no need for a recovery from a fall. So one thing we can point out, big picture to tie all this together, we don't really see a fall or a recovery narrative implied through Hymn to Aphrodite. We could go in and look for it a little bit and try to find it, but it's clearly not as obvious as it is in Genesis. So we can see some very stark differences between the two in the messages that they send out into the world in the thousands of years after they were written. All right, so those are the big takeaways for Module 1.1. Hope you enjoyed it. And now in the next module, we'll begin applying all of this to more modern literature and into more modern texts and real life texts and situations at that. So thank you all, and I'll see you soon.